G'day, I'm Owen and you've joined the pub test, and this is the first in what will be a series of videos on the trial of Charles Allen Lechmere. Eventually these will be put all into one big video, but for now I'll be releasing them in these smaller short bursts. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, tonight we are opening a case that is over a century old. But the suspect on trial was only recently raised as a serious contender as Jack the Ripper. So could the carman Charles Allen Lechmere, who identified himself as Charles Cross, who was the person who is said to have discovered the body of Polly Nichols, instead of being an innocent witness seeing something horrifying, could he be Jack the Ripper himself? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Now, before I dive into the trial itself, I just have to state why I'm covering this particular topic now. It has been put forth to me that I really need to do this full deep dive into the theory that Krista Holgram put out in the book Cutting Point. And I've been holding off for a couple of reasons. One, I sort of wanted some input from Krista Holgram himself, which doesn't seem to have happened. So I'm pressing forward anyway. But also from my own point of view, I was always interested in the Jack the Ripper Saga, and maybe about 10, 15 years ago, I sort of stopped really reading books on it and so forth. And then just in the last couple of years, when I started this YouTube channel, I just started going back into it. And it really surprised me that all of a sudden, the person I knew as Charles Cross, the person who saw Polly Nichols in Bucks Row, all of a sudden was a serious suspect. And not only that, if any suspect on this list could possibly lead to absolute vitriol from both sides, it was this bloke. And I'm thinking, how? Why? And initially when I was doing this channel, I really didn't understand the depth and complexity to this particular theory. And trust me, I have put a fair bit of time into looking at it. So in this video, I will be convincing you that Charles Lechmere is Jack the Ripper, and at the same time I'm going to be convincing you that Charles Cross is not Jack the Ripper. And yes, I did intentionally use both of his surnames here. But at the end of it all, well, it'll go out to the jury. You, the viewer, will be the jury. And I don't expect everyone to agree. I will at the end of it give my personal opinion, but then we get to see what everyone else thinks. But at the start of any trial, the defense and prosecution will have a sheet of paper which they say are agreed facts. The reason for that is there's no need to waste time and resources arguing something that is either immaterial to the case or you both have the same opinion on. So we will touch on some agreed facts that I think everyone, no matter which side of this argument you stand, would just have to say, well, it's true. Firstly, that Charles Cross / Lechmere could be Jack the Ripper. And what do I mean by that? I'm not saying that right now that he is. That's what the trial is for. But the fact that it's potentially possible. See, back in the day, we're not looking at this case from the investigation from 130 odd years ago. We're looking at it from today's perspective with what we know now and what the evidence actually shows. Because the police really were a little bit hamstrung in their investigation of Jack the Ripper. Because they were looking for someone who was most likely gay. They were looking for someone who was not only gay but probably foreign. And not only that, they were some type of monstrous person. Some deranged individual similar to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Mr. Hyde part of that. Someone that just couldn't control themselves and would appear like absolutely outside of society. In fact, the term degenerate was first being coined during this time in the 1880s, or probably a little bit before, as the theory of evolution was coming in. People said, well, this Jack the Ripper person has to be a degenerate. In other words, someone not fully evolved. A throwback to our more primal instincts. Now, as science has progressed, we understand that that's just not the case. There is not really such a degenerate type of person, though we still use the term, and that's where it comes from. But we also know that serial killers don't fit that mold of what we want them to be. And what I mean by that is that the people back, like the British people living in around the Whitechapel area and probably all of London, did not want to think that the perpetrator could have been a family man who's married to a woman who has children and has steady employment. Because that just wouldn't have fitted. They wanted it to be something that they couldn't get their head around. And then they could say, see, it's not one of us. But as a follower of true crime, you would know that that really isn't often the case when we come to these serial perpetrators. How many of them are family men with jobs? And the last person you would expect to be performing such hideous actions. And so for that reason, we have to accept the fact that Charles Lechmere makes this list, despite the normalcy in his life. Because these serial perpetrators are able to compartmentalize their lives. They can act a certain way around the family, but then act out their other things away from them. And the second agreed fact is, well, he was actually there. Unlike many suspects that get raised, we can agree that Charles Lechmere was on the scene. So during this, when I'm doing the defense part of it, I'll be raising some theories or ideas that maybe I don't believe fully myself, but I mean, a good defense lawyer will basically try and cast suspicion on anyone else other than their client. So I'll be doing a bit of that. But also, I won't be prosecuting the Thames Torso murders as part of this. Even though I know as part of the bigger theory, it's suggested that Charles Lechmere is both Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso murderer. My point there is, I think this video series would go on for a long time if I was covering that as well. But I feel that if I can't prove that he's Jack the Ripper, then there's no need to go after him for these other crimes. It's sort of like what the prosecution would do in real life, the cost to benefits. If we can nail him for Jack the Ripper, then do we need to pursue the others? But if you've just stumbled across this video and you are new to the pub test, well, absolutely welcome. I really hope you enjoy this video. But for that reason, I'll just give a brief rundown on the history of the Jack the Ripper crimes. There's a lot of information out there, so this is only an overview, but in 1888 in Whitechapel, it's an area in London, some terrible atrocities were happening to women. Now, these women were known as unfortunates because their lifestyle is not really the right word, but their circumstances in life is more to the point, where they fell on hard times for various reasons, and then the only way to make money and survive was, and for most of them this is the case, occasionally going out on the streets, seeking men for company, and the men would pay them the money. But because they were doing those things, it made them vulnerable, as it still would today if you were engaged in that occupation. But during this time in 1888, a series of attacks became known as the Autumn of Terror. And primarily, over time, it was considered that there were 5 canonical victims of one particular serial perpetrator, who, towards the end of this reign of terror, became known as Jack the Ripper, and that name has stuck throughout history since. And the first victim was found in Bucks Row, being Polly Nichols. And then Annie Chapman was found in Hanbury Street. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's Yard. almost 3 weeks after the Annie Chapman attack. But that very night, on the double event, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. And then it went quiet for a while, right up until early November, when in Miller's Court, Mary Kelly was attacked in her room, and that was the most brutal of all the crimes. And then it said, following that, Jack the Ripper disappeared. And as I stated earlier, in more recent times it has been suggested that Charles Lechmere, Charles Cross, a person that comes into this story at the very start, could have been that particular person. Well, let's now put this person on trial. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, whilst we don't have the suspect here before us, because that opportunity is long past, we are here today to prove that Charles Lechmere was one of the most sadistic, evil people ever to walk this earth. And the tragedy of it all is he's almost got away with it all. But what we do know of Jack the Ripper is two concrete things. He had to have had the opportunity to do the crimes and to get away with them, with all the police in force, all the vigilance committees who were hunting him down. He also needed intimate local knowledge of the streets, so that once performing a crime, he could then just disappear and possibly have family that he could duck into, unsuspecting family who would not know the actions that he was doing. Well, such a man was Charles Lechmere. During this autumn of terror, Charles Lechmere resided at 22 Doveton Street near Whitechapel, but he worked over at Pickford's, which was close to a 30 to 40 minute walk away. He worked as a carman, which was a delivery driver. He walked to work every morning. And if we bring up the map, if you can see that map, dotted are various attacks, not just the 5 canonical victims, but others as well. And as we see, they are so close together. But interestingly, Doveton Street is on one side of that, and Pickford's is on the other side. And so, Charles Lechmere walked these very streets, worked around these streets all the time. So if one person had the opportunity and had the local knowledge, it is Charles Lechmere. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as the defense for this person, I have to say, let's look at that map. The prosecution want to make a thing of it. Well, we note all these crimes did happen around each other, plus others. Except I would ask you particularly to look at the map of the double event. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. What do we see there? Well, it is actually, not on his way to work. He would not have walked past there. He would have had to have taken a massive detour to perform those crimes. And it's that double event probably happened on a day he wasn't working. So are they now suggesting that, well, he had a day off, so he thought he would go out and do a bit of murder? You're talking a bloke who's working 6 days a week, 12-hour days, and on his rest day, well, that's what he's motivated to go out and do. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that just seems a little bit fanciful. And to say, and the way the prosecution suggested it, he could be the only person that could have done this, the only person with the opportunity and the local knowledge. Well, we're going to see that's definitely not the case. And what also proves it, there's an eyewitness that will get discussed quite extensively in this trial, but Robert Paul, He'd never met Charles Lechmere, but he also walked to work every morning, and yet they crossed each other one morning, that fateful morning, August 31st, when Polly Nichols was found in Bucks Row. That's the first time they met each other. There were thousands of people walking to work at that time. So I really hope that the prosecution has a little bit more evidence than just opportunity and local knowledge. Well, I would like to thank my esteemed colleagues from the defence, but I will point out that there were not thousands of people in Bucks Row on August 31st when Polly Nichols was found brutally murdered. But I will say that the actions of Charles Lechmere was not one of an innocent eyewitness, but they were cold, they were calculating, and as said before, absolutely evil. Just consider, he first turns up and acts like a concerned citizen. He calls over another passerby, brings them over to the body and says, "Look what's happened here." And they're the actions that you would expect of someone to do. But then he doesn't want to touch the body. Then he says, "Well, I'm late for work. It's time for us to go." So both the gentlemen who found the body take off. And then when they do see a police officer, Charles Lechmere says, "Well, we don't know if she's dead." Well, if you didn't know the person had passed away, why aren't you offering assistance? Now that, dare I say it, does not pass the pub test. He also says to PC Misen, who he ran into in Hanbury Street, and remember Hanbury Street for later in this trial, but Robert Paul and Charles Lechmere go up Bucks Row into Hanbury Street, run into this police constable, and it's Charles Lechmere who says there's a policeman waiting for you back in Bucks Row. Now PC Misen is under the impression that it was the policeman that sent these two jokers up the street. And so PC Misen then doesn't think to get any details. He doesn't think to detain them because, maybe they've got questions to answer. He's under the assumption that it's the police constable back in Bucks Row that found the body, which means Charles Lechmere is able to continue on. And it's safe to say the way Charles Lechmere conducted himself, PC Misen wasn't alarmed. He was under the impression the situation was under control and he would get there very shortly. But there was no need for him to rush off. And so Charles Lechmere is able to disappear into the London fog. Or at least he would have if it wasn't for Robert Paul. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I am just saying that my colleagues there from the prosecution do raise a good point about Robert Paul, but we will get back to him. Firstly, what was PC Misen doing in Hanbury Street? Well, he was knocking people up. Now, I know that's going to sound a bit strange to people in North America and in the English-speaking parts of the Southern Hemisphere, but in the UK it means something totally different. It means you were knocking on people's doors to wake them up so they could get to work. And apparently that was a little bit of a paid job you could do. So it looks like PC Misen, well, he was sort of double dipping here. He had a bit of a side hustle, not just walking the streets, but at that time of the morning when people are getting up ready for work, that's what he was doing in Hanbury Street, knocking on a few doors to get people going. And so PC Misen's account of what actually happens is very interesting. Oddly, he really only mentions one person approaching him in Hanbury Street, and that person, it would generally appear to be Charles Lechmere. It's like Robert Paul wasn't even there. And when Charles Lechmere, who did identify himself as Cross at the inquest, said, "I never told PC Misen there was a policeman in Bucks Row. I said, there's a body back in Bucks Row and you are wanted. I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that PC Misen was distracted. He was worried about making his extra cash by knocking on doors to get people off to work. So he did not pay that much attention to these two. And then when that's brought up at the inquest, that's really not challenged. Like, one juryman does ask the person who identified himself as Charles Cross, what did you exactly say to the police constable? But then it's just this dropped. Now, if PC Misen really believed that Charles Lechmere had have mentioned a police officer was waiting for him, I think more of a deal would have been made of it back then. And in illustrations in papers of this particular event in Hanbury Street, they only show one person running up to the police constable, not two. But it was Robert Paul that started giving interviews to newspapers, and in those interviews he was making it seem like he was the primary person involved in this entire event. Yet oddly, Robert Paul goes missing. Charles Cross puts his hand up and says, I was that bloke in Bucks Row. Robert Paul's nowhere to be found. They have to hunt him down. It takes 2 weeks to find him, and they only get him to the inquest after the second attack done by Jack the Ripper. So I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that was it Robert Paul who perhaps performed that crime? Was it him who went into Bucks Row first, attacked Polly Nichols, heard someone coming, goes up the street in the dark a little bit, and then turns back and goes to walk past, and then gets dragged over by a concerned citizen, being my client, Charles Lechmere, and he makes sure that he touches the body. Because if there was blood on his hands, then that could easily be explained away. Charles Lechmere doesn't want to touch the body. But being the concerned person he is off to work. But he sees a policeman and runs up. That's why PC Misen really only recognised one person, and he says that person's in trouble back there. I'm not sure if she's dead. Because it's possible that it was Robert Paul who had only just attacked that poor woman. But Robert Paul, knowing what he had done, says no, she's definitely gone. Now, I'm not saying that for sure that that's how it happened, but I could easily see how it could have happened that way. And therefore, you must have reasonable doubt about the guilt of Charles Lechmere. Well, I think my colleagues from the defence are showing their desperation by basically trying to pin this on someone like Robert Paul. Typical tactic, anyone but my client. So before too long, they'll be pulling in the whole clown show of suspects, people that probably were not even near London at the time, just to confuse the issue. But make no mistake, PC Misen, and there is good evidence to show that was told that a policeman was waiting for him back in Bucks Row, and there's a good reason also as to why we can prove that. Now, PC Misen is not around to defend himself, but Charles Lechmere would have known the police beats. He was very familiar with the streets. He walked to work every morning and was doing so for 20 years up to this point. So it was no doubt he would have known that a policeman was soon to enter Bucks Row. Now, we will get into that interaction with Robert Paul later in this trial. But at that stage, he would have known the amount of minutes roughly he had before he needed to be away from that scene. But making it out of Bucks Row and then around into Hanbury Street and running into a police officer, Charles Lechmere could have confidently said, there's a policeman waiting for you back there, knowing full well that a policeman would have arrived, which they did. And so when PC Misen comes around to Bucks Row, there is a debate about who signalled who. We are not 100% sure, because both of them could have been thinking that they were signalling each other. because the policeman coming around the corner may not have got to the body at the point that PC Misen came into Bucks Row. But for that reason as well, no doubt Charles Lechmere was running to the police officer. He wanted to make sure that it was him that told the story. And that's why, to PC Misen, only one person stood out. And Hanbury Street itself plays a significant part in this particular trial, and also about the story of Charles Lechmere and why that particular crime happened. But I know the defence are going to raise a very crucial point. Did not Charles Lechmere present himself to the inquest less than 3 days after this attack on Polly Nichols? Well, yes, he did. And they made a good point that Robert Paul was missing. They had to go find him. But the question is, why? Why did Charles Lechmere come forward? Well, could you imagine him sitting down to read the newspaper, and here is this person who he thought was probably not that smart, and maybe he's not Robert Paul. That is up for you to determine, but he has a mouth, and he's telling all the papers about this story. He's telling different stories. Well, you need now to control that, because you know eventually they will find you. So what is the best course of action? Get in front of it. Get out before Robert Paul is dragged to the inquest, and you give your version of events, because that will be more believed. But then, to confuse the issue, well, you probably need to do another crime, and another crime quickly. Just remember that as we go through this trial. But the inquest is important, because he does not give his actual name. Instead of saying, I'm Charles Lechmere from 22 Dovedon Street, he says, I'm Charles Cross, which was another deception by Jack the Ripper. And I'm sorry, but court is adjourned for today. There is a lot more to go through. I'm only just scratching the surface of this up to now. So stay tuned for the next part coming out very shortly. And if you are able to hold off your judgment until the end of this series, and then you can give it a guilty or not guilty. Now, I've tried to park any of my own personal feelings and anything that could be considered confirmation bias so that I can present both sides of the argument in a fair way. And there's a lot more evidence to go, so make sure you give us a like, give us a subscribe so that you get to see all of this content. But as always, your support is genuinely appreciated. I'm Owen. You've been watching the pub test and the trial of Charles Lechmere, and we'll see you in the next part.